button. That work? Okay, so let's get into the questions.
Okay.
First one is, how do you suggest incorporating more beauty into our daily lives?
Oh. Well, you're the beauty expert.
I am the beauty expert. I'm an esthetician. Okay, so
Let me stop.
So beauty functions in a couple different ways. I'm actually writing a book on this, Christianity and the Arts, but to break this down as simply as I can, when it comes to natural beauty is the primary way in which we engage with God directly. Right? So when we go out into nature, when we experience God in nature, that is actually the primary way that we interact with His creation. To bring this kind of back a little bit as to why this is so important, back in the day, philosophers tried to figure out what the most fundamental aspects of reality are. And that's why they became obsessed with things like atoms and things like that. When it came to thought, they broke all thought down into 3 super categories. And some of you may have heard of these. Some of you guys may be sending your kids to classical education schools, so you already know about these. The true, the good, and the beautiful. Right? So the true, the good, and the beautiful are the 3 kind of fundamental realities of all thought and spirituality. And medieval theologians believed that the reasons why these were fundamental is because they described an important facet of God. So when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the light, he doesn't say, I say true things or I'm honest. He says, I am truth. He's saying there's something in my being that is synonymous with truth. When someone asks him, good teacher, what does it mean to be saved? He doesn't say, hey, go do good things. He says, there is one who is good, and that is God. He's saying that goodness is fundamental to God's being. And then when Peter and the other apostles are talking about the crucifixion of Jesus, they say if they knew who he was, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Glory is a more catch-all phrase, but it does mean beauty in a fundamental sense. So again, something in God's nature is true, something in God's nature is good, and something in God's nature is beautiful. That's why the Renaissance happened, is because people believe that you could interact with God not just through direct theology, but through his transcendental properties. So when I learn true things, I am interacting with God. Johannes Kepler, who was one of these astronomers who developed our laws of planetary motion, he called astronomers priests. He says, we describe God's creation and we glorify him in the realities of his universe. Okay? Then you have people who believe that in goodness, right? If I do something good, if I tell the truth as opposed to lying today, that's good. And by doing that, I am directly interacting with God's transcendental property of goodness. Beauty is the same thing. So a lot of Christians forget how important beauty is. The reason why the Renaissance happened is because a bunch of Christians started to believe that we can actually interact with God through the quality of beauty. And that's why they developed art. They believed that by developing art, you are actually creating things that associate with God. And that's why their highest aim was not to create preachy messages, but to create something beautiful. One of the reasons why Christian art fell away is because Christians started to believe art is only something that carries a message. It's a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. And so we started creating subpar art. The beautiful thing for now is that the world has fallen into the same pit, which is great, which is why Hollywood is screwing up right now, right? So they're creating message-first art that's terrible and no one likes it. That's a good thing. That leaves an opening for Christians. So what I tell people is like, nature is the primary way you're going to interact with God's transcendental property of beauty. When you go out into nature and you learn to be in awe of your surroundings. So don't just go on a nature walk. Pause. Look at the things that you're looking at. Be in awe of what God has created as often and as much as you can. But also interact with beauty, right? Interact with art, good art. Me and my wife have a rule in our house. We will not expose our kids to anything that is ugly, right? So if they're watching a movie and I'm like, that's an ugly movie, they don't watch it. Okay, that's offensive. No, I'm just kidding. It's bad because, again, it's just like your sense of truth and your sense of goodness develop over time. Your sense of beauty develops over time. So if you only expose your child to false things, they're not going to have a good track on truth. If you only expose your child to bad behavior, they're not going to have a good track on goodness. If you only expose your child to subpar art, right? They're only exposed to ugly art or demeaning art. They're not going to have a good track of beauty as well. So you could actually lift the soul to enjoy beautiful things. So if you ever listen to classical music and it's not my thing, try it. Try it. Exercise your aesthetic sense to higher forms of beauty. Don't just stay at what's comfortable for you. Push yourself a little bit. Read old books. Watch old movies. Get involved in things that are truly, truly great as opposed to just things that are kind of subpar. So again, it's not that social media and things like that in themselves or YouTube is in and of themselves bad, but there is dumb art on YouTube, and it's bad for your kid's aesthetic sense. Right? That's the best way I would put it.
When I heard that question, I was like, I would never ask that question because I think very differently from Peter. And so it is actually good that we're together. When he talks about beauty, I'm like, wow, I had never thought about that. But I do understand what he's talking about when he says an ugly movie. So I would say, I wouldn't call it an ugly movie. I would call it like a not good movie. And so I don't think the same way that Peter does, but I do understand what he's saying, that it's important, and I totally agree, to expose them to God's goodness. And maybe I wouldn't call it beauty, but what would I call it? What do you think I'd call it?
Like good art?
Yeah,
good
maybe good art. I don't go to museums. And so if that's not you, that's not your natural ability. But I do believe there's beauty in nature. I do believe in the scriptures, the beauty of scriptures and how it's written. So we don't have to always think of it that way, but we can understand beauty in like what he's saying is helping our kids to just enjoy simple things, even like being outside and digging in the dirt. There's beauty. So I just want to say that you don't have to think exactly like those kinds of questions. You can still pull meaning from things that you might not directly relate, which I didn't, but I can have an appreciation for what Peter's saying.
And I'd also say, kids are innately attracted to beauty. They want to be in nature. You have to actually do the opposite to make kids stay out of nature. Right? The kids naturally want to go in nature. They want to be in beauty. And their capacity for wonder is actually what makes hanging out with kids so fun. Kids still think that the world is wondrous, and they want to explore it. They want to discover it. Something that Jonathan Haidt mentions is that there are two modes that you function in, discover mode and danger mode. So danger mode is when you're assessing threats. Discover mode is when you're actually trying to discover wonder. And so when you're in a dangerous situation, you're not in discover mode. You're not looking for beauty. You're looking for dangerous things. So if I'm in the jungle might be very beautiful, but I'm not actually looking at the beauty. I'm not actually experiencing awe because I'm looking for the next thing that's going to try to eat me, right? I have to be in a place where I feel relatively safe in order to actually experience beauty. Another reason why kids don't experience beauty is because parents make them afraid of the world, right? So they're just constantly in danger mode, and they're just assessing threats everywhere they go, as opposed to being in a state of awe and wonder, which is glorious and awesome. So, yeah.
I'll read it.
I'll read the next question. And we know that some of you didn't turn these in, or you might want to raise your hand. So if we want to build anti-fragility in our children and not only protect them from the stressors of the world, how do you recommend that we look at the two ends of the spectrum? Homeschoolers versus public school.
That's a good question.
And there's more to it, let's see. We want to protect, but not overprotect. Oh, I guess these are two different questions. Okay.
Okay, so this is going to be controversial. What I'm about to say is controversial. So again, I don't want to become overly dogmatic about certain things. When it comes to school, what's happening is that your child is going into an environment in which there's an authoritative structure. And that authoritative structure at fundamental levels does disagree with our worldview. Okay? So if your child is going to be able to learn in that environment, they have to be equipped and prepared to be antagonistic towards that authority structure. That's kind of weird, right? That's how my parents sent me to public school, but that is it. So I got into it with a lot of the teachers. So the main thing that my parents were trying to rein in with me is being respectful to people that I disagree with, because I was a very I kind of still am. I try to rein it in a little bit, but I tend to be very disrespectful to people that I don't like. But that was the main thing that my parents were trying to teach me, because they did send me there as to an antagonistic environment. That's what they were saying. Like, you're going into an antagonistic environment. They don't agree with our values. They don't agree with our worldview. Take everything that they're saying to you with a grain of salt. If you don't agree with what they're saying, ask questions, right? That was how they raised me. Looking back on it, it's like, would I do the same thing for my kids? I don't really know. It's like I said, it is kind of a personal, positional preference that you're doing. However we educate our kids, you do have to expose them to antagonistic ideas, because if they're never exposed to antagonistic ideas, like I said, it makes them fragile in their worldview. It makes them fragile in their thoughts. So, as I said, there's different ways that you can accomplish the same thing, but that is what you're trying to accomplish. So for a homeschool parent, your challenge is, how do I still expose my kid to antagonistic ideas, things that are against our worldview, so that they learn how to develop their own thoughts, so that they're not just believing whatever you believe without any critical thinking involved. The challenge for the parent that's going to send their kid to a public school is, how do I prepare my child's mind to be able to be antagonistic in the environment that they're going in? And you can do that in different ways. Some parents would maybe even say, like, maybe I'll homeschool for elementary school and maybe middle school, and then high school they'll go to a public school or something like that. Like, I'm going to prepare them in that way. That's more of a personal preference, but I know that you and Kevin handled that. And you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I would say I went to a public school, and for me, my parents, taught me maybe to look at, but not authority, to other people, where I could be antagonistic to maybe peers, but not authority. And so that experience for me, I wasn't a follower of Christ, but wasn't a positive experience. I feel like it was very influential in the way that I went, which was not following Christ. I didn't know Christ. But so we chose to send our kids. I didn't know anything about homeschooling back then. Homeschooling was a lot different when my kids were young.
It's grown a lot.
Yeah, it's grown a lot. And I do believe there's ways to, I do believe you can send them to public school, and like Peter said, teach them how to not just be fed what the teachers are teaching them. I mean, you need to do that even in private school, because not everyone in private school is going to think, or private Christian school, is going to think the way critically thinking. Even schools that say that's the way you need to think. So in homeschooling, I feel like you're also going to get antagonism in homeschooling. But my belief in that is that it's better controlled. Because when you send your kids to public school, even if you're attempting to do that, who has the majority of influence over your kids? And so because of, it's different even from when I went to school, because I'm older. So when I went to school, I don't believe that the public school was trained to have us brainwashed in a certain way. And nowadays, not all schools do this, but many of the schools, they're trying to teach your kids to think in the Marxist way. And so I think you'd have to be very well prepared, and kids very well prepared, to all day be in that environment. And maybe your kids go to a school where it's not like that. Well, that's a praise, but they still need to be prepared for that. And so I do think that you still can get in homeschooling that idea of putting them under kind of the pressure to question ideas. And I mean, I think it would be necessary if you did homeschooling that you do need to have them with peers, and you need to have them with other teachers.
One last thing I'll mention is, so this is kind of, if you want more information on this, you could read Carla Montessori's handbook. It's really good. It's short. It's not very long. You could read The Marxification of Education by, I think, David Lindsay. There are numerous books, Inside American Education by Thomas Sowell, like a lot of really good books on this. One of the main reasons, so when I was talking to my wife about sending our kids to school, I value good education. And what I told her is like, brainwashing aside within the public school just failed to educate me.
That's true.
They're just not
That's
good
true.
at their job. I don't know. Like, I mean, and it's because
They've also lowered the standards.
they've lowered the standards, and they're functioning off a principle of education that's just not correct.
Yeah.
So, meaning that they're trying to educate kids in a way that kids are not open to be educated in. So in other words, parents, try to educate your kids in the way that the teachers try to educate your kids. Just sit them down and talk to them about stuff that they don't care about, and see how long they pay attention, how much stuff they retain. You know, like it just doesn't work. You lock your kids in a room, and again, we're talking about beauty. Lock your kids in a room, cut off from all beauty, in a place that's just ugly. All schools are just ugly. In a dark room where they're not allowed to play, and for 8 hours a day, just talk to them about stuff that they do not care about. It's just not going to work. So that's another criticism I have of education. One of the reasons why we're considering going the homeschool route as parents actually it does have a little bit to do with the brainwashing that happens in school, but it has a little bit more to do with the fact that I just don't think it's an effective methodology of education. So that's another direction we can go, but pertaining to the actual question, which was about anti-fragility, that's the obstacle you have to overcome, I think, is again, balancing out how much ideas that your kids are being exposed to and how they're understanding them, right? That's the idea of critical thinking. It's not insulating them from ideas, but it's helping them understand the ideas in the context of their own worldview, right? Okay, so final question we got on the paper. What's a good age to start considering cell phones? And what would it look like for social media exposure that is safe? This is going to depend on you as a parent. You're going to have to make that call. What I would say is the excesses you have to avoid. So I'm just going to spell out the excesses. It's like, if you want to go the Amish route, you want to do that and just be like, we're not going to expose our kids to technology. That's how we're going to do. You have to supplement that with a community of kids that they could actually play with.
That are not using cell phones.
That are not using cell phones, right? So if you're going to do that, like, you do not, like, your kid is going to learn so much of their social skills through playing with other children. If you're saying, I don't want my kid exposed to technology, now your primary job as a parent is, how do I get my kid to play with kids that are also not using technology? That's a pretty massive hurdle to overcome. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that's just a big hurdle to overcome. Also, the next hurdle that you have to overcome is, like I said, if your kid wants to use social media and you telling them no, you're going to have to figure out a way for them to understand the law behind the law. Meaning, like, what are you trying to prevent in them, and why are you giving them this age of accessibility, I guess. That's also very difficult to do. Again, it's not insurmountable, but it is a tough hurdle to overcome. The parents that are going to go the exposure route, like we talked about with minimum necessary involvement, that's the ideal that you're going to have to function off of. So if I'm going to give my kid technology, I cannot be monitoring every little thing that they do. That doesn't work, right? The whole point of exposure is so that they learn confidence and resilience. So I need to be able to, like, what is the minimum necessary involvement that I need to have in my kid's life so that they're not being exposed to incredibly antagonistic things, and that they're balanced out as an individual where they could actually have fun and play. So some parents do things like they have Sabbaths, right? They're like, hey, Saturday, no technology. We're putting all the stuff in the bin and we're just going to hang out and we're going to develop in person. Or there's like a time limit of like, this is how much you can use during the day, and then it's over. There are ways to do it, but like I said, it's not about really exposure in that sense. It's about what are they missing out on when they're doing this thing, and I just want to make sure it's well-rounded. Now, there are different ways to teach that lesson to kids. I'm not going to get into that right now, but there are different ways where you can violate your own rule to teach your kid a lesson through that exposure. It's similar to like a parent who tells their kid not to put their hand in the fire, and then they're like, okay, go for it. You know, like, you know, you're not going to let your kid stick your face in the fire, but, you know, you'd be like, hey, if you think you're right, like, okay, I'm going to tell you why this is probably a bad idea, but if you want to do it and you want to, this is what's going to happen, and I'm going to help you understand the consequences of your behavior. The natural consequences that you tend not to associate with your behavior, I'm going to help you understand them. That's another way to go about it.
Yeah, and that would be a father. Go ahead, stick your hand in the fire. A
Yeah.
mother would be like, let's get it close. Let's just see. And that's why
Maybe
God
a
gave us
finger.
mothers and
Yeah,
fathers.
yeah, that's right.
I have older kids, and so we didn't really understand cell phones, I think, when, I don't know how old I was when I got the brick cell phone. And then when my kids came along, I knew that I wasn't supposed to give it to them when they were really young, so I didn't. But I think it started about when they drove, and it was like important for them to have a phone at that point, I felt like. But we didn't understand the kind of the good comes along with bad. And so even if Peter's saying the minimum amount of involvement, I'm not sure exactly you're saying this in regards to what I'm saying, but you can correct me if I'm not wrong. If I'm wrong. So I think if you are going to give your kids a device, it is your responsibility to know what they can access on that device, because there's worse evils than social media even. And kids are going to access that on social media, on the internet, if they have a smartphone, which that's pretty much all you can get these days. You can't even get a dumb phone anymore. So I think if you are not up on technology yourself, it's not wise to have your kids using cell phones. So you need to know that you have to actively be involved. And I would say it's more than minimum with the phone. Like, we actually had our kids, when they got older, like, I purposefully moved to the iPhone so that I could take off all internet except for certain apps that I allowed them to be on. And then you could also have, you could shut down all kinds of sites, and that was for their protection. And some parents could say, well, don't they need to see some of that? But if we agree with what Peter's saying about the developing mind at that age, and they're learning the culture, think about pornography, what these kids are being exposed to. Like, it is horrific if you don't know what's going on in that. And these are what your sons and daughters are seeing as intimacy. And so it is our responsibility to be actively involved. And it takes a lot of time. I mean, you have to have at least one of the parents who are regularly looking at that. And we had phones were all in our bedrooms, because also it interrupts their sleep all night long. They're texting. You need to be checking texts, because did you know these young kids are sexting each other and sending nude pictures? And I know this is stuff that, like, maybe we don't want to think about, but as Christians, it is our responsibility to protect our kids in that.
Yeah. And that is what minimum necessary involvement means. I mean, it's like, what are the consequences that I feel like are too high for my child to handle?
Yeah.
And what do I need to do to prevent that from happening?
Mm-hmm.
Maximum is like, what is all the fears and worries that could possibly happen to my child, and how do I involve myself in all those potential worries? And like I said, there has to be a good dialogue between you and your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a good dialogue of, like, what does that look like for us? Because, as I said, anxiety tends to trickle down. So if we're in a state of frenzy as parents, and we're like, oh my gosh, what if they access it? What if they, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That becomes really bad, and it ends up defeating the purpose for why you're even allowing your kid on the phone in the first place.
Well, you
right?
become controlling.
And it seems like you're giving them countervailing information, where it's like, use this, but don't use it. Like, it's like, yeah, sure, it's open for you, kid, but I'm going to be judging everything you're doing. So there has to be a bit of a balance there. It's a hard balance to achieve. That's why I'm trying not to give, like, overly definitive statements, but I do want to show that there are actual excesses that we ought to be trying to avoid as parents. Speaking of developing mind, something I forgot to mention, we're worried about kids in a developmental state of mind. Think about this for a second. It's like, you do have drugs and alcohol that we're trying to keep out of kids' hands specifically for that purpose, because their brains are still developing. How many kids are on psychological medication during this process of development? You know what I mean? And when if you read Bad Therapy, she does a very good job of explaining all the studies. We do not know what these pills do long-term to developing minds. We we really, really don't, right? So there are other things that we might be doing that are putting a bit of a blanket on your kid's personality and preventing them from actually interacting with their world in an appropriate way. But yes, so social media and the internet, and as Lisa said, again, saying someone's online is a little like just saying they're on planet Earth. There's so many things that they could be doing online. I need to be determining like what are the things that are necessary to prevent from them accessing. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something, because pornography is one thing, but also the social media for our young girls, having to have those good conversations with your girls, because all these girls are on social media, TikTok, and watching how they have to be skinny, and it's just so much. So if you have the ability and the time and the willingness, which we should, to talk to our kids about that, we can use it. And say our kids do access pornography, say they do access something and they start, it's like, how do you walk through that with them? How can you help use that as training so they understand like how this is affecting them? So I think, you know, that is a way that we don't have to watch every little thing, but we should be watching. And I know Peter doesn't want to give like the definitive, but I think sometimes we just have to know, okay, if we're going to do this, we do have to watch what they're doing. Now, not all the time, because you will be that anxious parent that's like, oh my gosh, and I messed up my kid, he saw pornography. And, you know, it's like, how do you walk through that with them and teaching them about that? And also maybe, you know, because what Abigail Shire is saying is that not all therapy is bad. And so obviously, Peter and I do biblical counseling. And so if your kid does get involved in some of these things, sometimes it's out of your purview. You would need to get help either from someone like maybe your pastor or someone that does biblical counseling in your church, or Peter or I, to help you to know how to walk through these things with your kids.
Yeah. Abigail Shire does a very good job of explaining kind of how the anxiety of especially young girls is affected by social media accounts. And when we're talking about resiliency in kids as well, there's also a concept of like what advice, even harsh advice, do you let in? Right? Because you do have to let harsh advice in. If you immunize yourself to all harsh advice, then you've immunized yourself to growing as an individual.
Tell them what you mean by harsh advice.
So harsh advice would be like if someone has a rebuke for me, like they actually think I'm doing something wrong. If I insulate myself from rebuke, which is something that social media also allows you to do, right? You can mute people. That's actually a bad thing, right? It's a bad thing for me. So the first piece of advice that I got when I was about to become a pastor, which was actually a very good piece of advice, I think, is they say very quickly, develop personal relationships with people who you trust, who will not soft soap answers for you, who will, like, if they have something to say to you, they will say it to you, and they will say it directly, and maybe even sometimes rudely, right? But like, surround yourself with those people, because once you start becoming more and more in a public sphere, you no longer can trust the things that people are telling you, because it will be over praise, or it will be over criticism, but there's not going to be actual truth, right? So with kids, I think there's another good principle there of when they're going into the social media space, they're exposing themselves to a lot of criticism, right? A lot of criticism from people who may not necessarily know them. And to prepare them to receive that, it's like, you can't, again, treat your child's personality like it's fragile. Like, you know, I don't want anyone to talk bad about my child. True, but it's going to happen because there are things about your child that are bad, and people are going to notice it, and they're going to criticize.
Are you talking about like posts on their social media and stuff?
Posts on the social media, things like that, yeah.
Okay.
So it's good that your child is ready to receive that, and they understand like what it means to have trusted sources that are able to speak into their life both negatively and positively. How are we doing on time, Randy?
Kind of like a last question type thing.
Okay.
It's 1 o'clock right now.
Oh.
There it is. Last question.
Peter, based on these two books, do you feel like a strong position was put forward that it might be reasonable to have a different approach towards access to the internet for male and female children?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Those of you guys didn't hear it. He said, based on the books, do you think that there's a good argument to be made for restriction of internet for male versus female? But
Maybe a different approach.
Different
based on
approach.
gender difference.
Oh, okay.
yeah, no, very good question. I would say that they do present very compelling arguments for that. So, in other words, it's like, think about this. Like social media, the internet is like an amplifier. That's what it is. It amplifies everything. And so it amplifies good things and it amplifies some not so good things. So in men, what is the direction that men tend to go to when it comes to excesses in our personality and masculinity, right? Well, one of the things that's happening, and this has to do with the direction of our culture, is men in a feminized culture tend to go into a position of atrophy, if you want to put it that way. So meaning if men are told that you are kind of superfluous to the culture and you don't really matter, and really women, the future is female, and that's what you're hearing all the time, it's very easy for you to recede. So this whole principle of like failure to launch, as you hear that, it was a male phenomenon when I was a kid, right? Before social media or anything like that. The social media has just kind of amplified that. And the big reason for that is because most things that you engage in have a clear and definitive cause and effect corollary. So if I spend all day shooting up heroin or something like that, and I'm not doing anything with my life, that's very obvious, right? It's very obvious that I'm falling into the sin of sloth and I'm not really accomplishing anything. It's still very difficult to get away from that because I found something that I like more than being functional, but it's still something that is obvious. When it comes to video games and social media, the biggest danger of them is that they give the feeling of accomplishment, right? So if I'm playing video games, it actually can feel as though I'm accomplishing something. I'm actually like doing something useful and good, which I may not be. And so it's easier to kind of pull you in, right? Where girls, not so much, right? Girls play video games? Yeah, but it's just predominantly kind of a male thing. Another way you could look at it is like, okay, what happens if you put a group of boys in a room together, right? You put a group of boys in a room together with no instruction. What's going to happen? They're going to find some stupid way to compete with one another. That's what they're going to do. They're going to find something you've left in the room, and they're going to make a competition out of it. That is what boys gravitate toward. If you put a bunch of girls in a room together, and again, you don't give them any instruction, what are they going to do? They're probably going to be talking about more, feminine things. They're going to be talking about, boys, makeup, things like that. They're going to be. So that's what social media has done, right? So you put a bunch of boys in a room together, what are they going to do? They're going to play video games and they're going to compete against one another. You put a bunch of girls in a social media space together, what are they going to do? They're going to be talking about boys and makeup and like more effeminate kind of things. They're going to be on more gossipy side. So when you look at female propensities on the digital landscape, they're going towards more like gossip websites, things like that, and more like comparing themselves and beauty products and diet YouTube videos and exercise YouTube videos, things like that. Men are predominantly going towards like podcasts, like informational things, and games. That's what they're doing. So because of that,
And nudity.
and nudity and pornography, you are correct. Mm-hmm. So men tend to go more towards pornography than women do. So because of that, there's actually pretty good arguments that social media and internet, if you're going to restrict it, it makes more sense to restrict it for females rather than males, because it's more destructive, right? So in other words, for men, what's the danger? They're going to become slothful and not do anything. That's bad, but again, it's easy to kind of point out, because most men want to be active, it's easy to point out to them, like, you're very inactive, you need to go do something. For women, because it goes into those anxiety spaces, those gossip spaces, it can be very damaging for them if they don't know what kind of critique is good to let in, which is not, right? Girls tend to also bend towards more people-pleasing tendencies, right? Of like, they want to please everyone who is speaking to them. So it's very hard for them to shut out the kind of criticism that they're going to incur once they put themselves online and vulnerable to a lot of interaction. So also, female bullies are a thing, and the digital landscape is the best place for them to function on, right? Male bullies, it's like, are there male bullies on the digital landscape? Yeah. But they usually function like female bullies, because male bullies are physical, right? They want dominance through power. And in order to have dominance through power, you got to be in the same space as somebody. So female bullies are attacking someone's character and bringing them down emotionally. That could be a very damaging thing. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But yeah, I think that there would be a stronger argument for women as opposed to men.
Well, since we're out of time, we want to thank Hope Church and Randy for providing the space and for lunch. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And as Peter said, Peter and I are brainstorming, or did you say this, or did you just say it individually? Oh, brainstorming like what's next, possibly more parenting seminars or classes, just depending on what the need is.
Yeah, I would say if because this session was probably like drinking out of a fire hose. I kind of went over a lot of stuff. If this kind of stuff interests you and you would want more of it, let us know, and we can maybe have a time where we just focus on one of these things and talk about it in a more directed way.
Okay, you want to pray?
Yeah, unless you want to pray, Randy?
Oh,
Oh, you got.
All right,
do
go
you
for it.
do you have to say something
I
else?
have announcements.
Oh, he has not.
All right, cool. Well, Father, thank you so much for our time being here. I know that the reason why we're here is because we love you and we want to honor you. And the greatest honor you've given us is to form life in our image through a loving relationship and to be able to bring those children up in a way that they're prepared and ready to honor and glorify you. So, Lord, we know ultimately, though, these are your children. Right? Our kids, you have given us stewardship over them. We're able to have the great privilege and honor of being there for them in these amazing times of their life, and to be able to speak into their life and to raise them in a way that is honoring and acceptable to you, Lord. But ultimately, they're your kids. Help us to trust you in the way that they're developing. Help us to give more and more of our authority over to you, Lord, and to help our own anxiety so that we can have a life of peace and confidence in your plans and your sovereignty. We love you, Lord, and through your Son we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And thank you, guys. Super
Hello.
cool.